Now, I'm supposed to answer a question for you, which is the American century over? And in good academic fashion, I'll tell you the answer right at the beginning. Yes and no. Let me explain. If you look at public opinion polls and ask about the United States, it's clear that a good proportion of the people, majorities in the United States, but in many other countries, including Britain, say that the United States is in decline. A recent Pew poll found that in 15 of 22 countries surveyed, most say that China either will replace or has already replaced the United States as the world's leading superpower. In Britain, those rating China as number one rose from 34% in 2009 to 47%. And when my favorite pink paper puts a headline on the front page saying China to pass the U.S. this year, then you know it's real. However, should we be worried about this? And my answer is no, not really. And there are a couple of reasons. One is we've seen some of this before. Polls are not a very good indicator of power. They're an indicator of people's perceptions of power, and we're often misperceiving. If you look back at the period of the 1950s, after the Soviets launched Sputnik, there was a majority of people in the United States who thought the United States was in decline. Indeed, that was the period when we thought that Khrushchev was correct when he said he was going to bury us economically. In the 1980s, similarly, when Japan was doing so well, the Japanese were 10 feet tall. And now we no longer think the Japanese are 10 feet tall. Today, it's the Chinese who are 10 feet tall. And I suspect that, in fact, despite all the interesting things about the great accomplishments that China has made, I think that at some point, 10 years from now, we'll look back on this with a bit of perspective as well. But I think equally important in terms of perspective about why we should not be overly concerned about this is if you look back at the period when the United States had more power than any other country or any time since 1945 to 1960, what's quite remarkable is how little control we had. Here we had the only country with nuclear weapons. We had nearly half the world's gross domestic product. And in those circumstances, we couldn't prevent Stalin developing a nuclear weapon. We couldn't prevent Mao from taking over China. We couldn't roll back communism in Eastern Europe or protect the Hungarians, as Eisenhower had talked about in the '52 campaign. We couldn't prevent Cuba from going communist. If that's hegemony, to have this extraordinary power that the Americans had at that time, exactly what is hegemony worth? And what I'm going to suggest to you, and I'll come back to this at the end, is that there are enormous myths about hegemony. There are enormous myths about what was the American era. And that if we want to understand the future, we have to get away from those myths and have a clearer perception of reality. But let me first address this question of whether the United States is in decline. If we talk about decline, it helps to distinguish two aspects of the word, absolute decline and relative decline. And it's important in that sense to realize that there's a lot that we don't know about decline. It's not an organic process. When you look at a human being, an individual organism, you have a pretty good idea of what a life cycle is. I can assure you without fear of contradiction that I am in decline. But if you look at a country, you have no idea what is decline or not. It took Rome 300 years to go from the apogee of its power to the end of its power, at least the western half of Rome. If you look at the 18th century, there's a wonderful statement from Horace Walpole in which he laments after Britain has lost its North American colonies. He said, "Woe is Britain, we're now reduced to a miserable little island like Sardinia or Denmark." The Danes wouldn't appreciate being called an island, but that's the quote. He missed entirely Britain's second century, when the Industrial Revolution produced this extraordinary growth, which Hamish referred to this morning. So we have no idea where America is in a cycle, and we have to be very careful about using the word decline as though we understood it as some sort of a clear organic metaphor. Let me turn first to the question of relative decline. Since we've talked a lot about that, I won't spend too much time on it, but on American power relative particularly to China. If you look at the BRICS, really, when you take the concept apart, it's one country that is most of the BRICS. If you did a chart, with a bar chart, which you said, which country has most of assets in terms of GDP of any of the BRICS, it's clearly China. So yes, Brazil is important, India is important, but as somebody that might challenge the United States in the next 20, 30, 40 years, it really is, in that sense, China that we want to focus on. And the fact that China will surpass the United States in total size of its GDP, whether it's this year, which I doubt, unless you think a measure, PPP, which is designed to measure consumption, is good for measuring relative power. I don't think it is. It's good for welfare. I can get a haircut more cheaply in China than I can in the United States. I can't make a jet engine in China than I can in the United States. So I tend to go with Hamish this morning when he was saying, let's use exchange rates. But even if you use exchange rates for this international measurement of power, since we're interested in power rather than relative welfare, China will pass the United States with a high level of probability, certainly if not by the 2027 date that Hamish mentioned this morning, but perhaps even sooner. I mean, if you have an economy of 1.3 billion people and it's growing at rates that are, let's call it 7% or even 6%, and another economy is growing 2 to 3%, those lines are going to intersect. So I think that is going to happen. The question is, what does it mean? And I think if you look, I wrote a book called The Future of Power, which Francis alluded to, which has a chapter on economic power. Very often people don't look at enough of the different aspects of economic power to get a proper assessment. Total size of your market, total size GDP, is indeed one form of power. If you want access to a market and somebody else can deny that market, that's a form of power. But per capita income may be a better measure of the sophistication of an economy. So if you look at per capita income and you want to know why is the renminbi unlikely to be a reserve currency very soon, or why is it the dollar has the status it has despite the mess the Americans made, as Lula pointed out, and that's one of the slides Kai put up this morning, the answer is because of the sophistication of the financial markets and the institutional instruments and the rule of law that goes with it, as well as some policy points about the Americans allowing convertibility and the Chinese not. But as you try to look at the various dimensions of economic power, don't focus just on GDP, whether it's measured in PPP or exchange rates. Per capita income is of considerable importance. And on per capita income, if one is optimistic, China probably won't equal the United States in per capita income for another 30 or 40 years. If then. I mean, so we're a long way off from these being equivalent types of economies, even just thinking of economic power. If you go beyond economic power and you realize that, in my terms at least, power has three different aspects. It has economic power, military power, and soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. In those dimensions, the other two dimensions of power, China is also well behind the United States. And I would say by inclusion, what I say is true for China in relative power is true for the other BRICS, which essentially are behind China. And in that sense, in military power, China has been increasing its military budget by double digits for a decade. But even so, it's about 1/4 of American military expenditure. And China has its first aircraft carrier, which is a training carrier, basically an old refurbished Ukrainian carrier. But there's a large difference between having one carrier and having 8 to 10 carrier battle groups. And it's in the sense of the ability to project power globally. China won't be in the same ballpark as the United States for several decades. Can it increase its capacity to push on this first island chain to make the American defense in East Asia seas more difficult? Absolutely. But is it going to be able to rival the Americans for, let's say, deciding to protect or not protect the Straits of Hormuz? Not for a long time. So in military power, China is also not going to be equal to the United States for some time. And if you look at soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction and persuasion rather than coercion and payment, China is spending billions of dollars on soft power. When Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress in 2007 that China needed to invest more in its soft power, that was a very wise decision for China. If your hard power, economic and military, is burgeoning, what's going to happen? You're going to frighten your neighbors. They're going to form coalitions against you. If you can increase your soft power in a commensurate way with your hard power so that you're attractive, you're less likely to have your neighbors form those type of coalitions. So China has been spending billions of dollars on this, but getting a very poor return on its investment. So Chinese, when you look at polls taken by the BBC or Pew Charitable Trust and so forth, Chinese soft power is not doing very well. But we'll leave that for questions that people want. The main point is that on these three dimensions of power, China is not going to equal the United States for some time. In addition, there is a geopolitical dimension, which is that China has a problem, which is it has territorial conflicts with a large number of neighbors. We talked about some of that in the panels earlier. But what that means is that as China tries to increase its soft power by creating a Confucius Institute in Manila or Hanoi, and at the same time it sends an oil rig off the Paracel Islands or coastal ships to beat the Philippine ships away from Scarborough Reef, it can do quite easily what it needs to do with hard power at the cost of totally undermining its soft power. So in geopolitical terms, it's as though the Americans had hostile neighbors in Canada and Mexico. In fact, we have friendly neighbors and a lot of fish on both sides. So in that sense, the overall power position of China compared to the United States is really the poorer hand of the two. If you were a person from Mars and you had to play these two hands in a poker game and behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, you didn't know which hand you were going to get, you definitely want the American hand and not the Chinese hand. And that will continue, I would argue, for decades, despite the headlines about PPP and China passing the U.S. this year. So I don't think that in relative decline we're about to see this great alarm that the public opinion polls show many people have. I mean, many of these polls say China has already passed the U.S. in terms of overall power. This shows the public can be wrong. As for absolute decline, then that's an interesting question. Many people say, well, the Americans, maybe China won't pass the Americans, but the Americans have such trouble, they're in such deep internal decline, that they will essentially take care of this problem by just their own decline. And it could be pointed out that Rome didn't succumb to a rival empire passing it. It succumbed to hordes of barbarians and internal strife. And so people will sometimes say that by analogy with the Roman Empire, the United States is going to solve this question of relative power by essentially its absolute decline. I don't think this is a very good analogy. Rome had almost no productivity in its economy. Its growth and wealth came from capturing others or taking their resources. Instead, the United States economy remains highly productive. First in total R&D expenditures, first in university rankings, even by Chinese measures, first in Nobel Prizes, first in indices of entrepreneurship, and according to the World Economic Forum, with its annual reports on competitiveness, the United States is seventh most competitive economy in the world. The competitors who do better are usually small, like Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, Singapore. China, by this measure, ranks 26th. Moreover, the United States remains at the forefront of such cutting-edge technologies as biotechnology and nanotechnology. And if you look at energy and look at the so-called shale revolution and the way in which the new technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing have changed the American position in terms of energy, and you go back to Hamish's charts this morning, I would say this is hardly a picture of economic decline. The view that the United States is in decline and that there's an analogy to Rome just strikes me as good for some editorial writers, not very good for social science analysis. Now, some people will say, yes, but it's not the economy, it's American society, which is becoming sclerotic, like Britain was at the peak of its power a century ago. But if you look at American power today in the social sense, American culture is much more entrepreneurial and decentralized than was at Britain when the sons of industrial entrepreneurs sought aristocratic titles and honors in London. And despite bouts of historical concern about immigration that the Americans go through, in fact, immigration keeps America quite flexible. In 2005, foreign-born immigrants participated in 1 out of every 4 technology startups in the previous decade. I once remember talking to Lee Kuan Yew about the relative position of the United States and China, and I asked him whether he thought China would pass the United States. He said, no. He said, they'll give you a run for your money. But he said, the difference is the following. He said, China can draw on a talent pool of 1.3 billion people, but the U.S. can draw on a talent pool of 7 billion people. And what's more, it can recombine them in a diverse culture that enhances creativity in a way that ethnic Han nationalism can never match. This from a very proud ethnic Han nationalism. So I think in that sense, and it goes back to the demographic slide that Hamish had about among the advanced countries, the one country that doesn't decline in terms of total population is the United States. Now, when people say, okay, we'll follow you this far, but it's American politics. I mean, you know, sure, the economy's doing better than expected, and maybe the society still is robust because of immigration and flexibility, but your political system is terrible. It's inefficient. And it's true that we're going through a particular difficult time now in terms of polarization, but it's also true that our political system has always been inefficient. It was designed to be that way. You remember the founding fathers created the American system of checks and balances so that King George couldn't rule over us and neither could anyone else. And in that sense, we have a situation where you have a difficult political system, but it's also a political system which, despite its current blockages and unpleasantness, is not that different from the past. Read a little bit about the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, or Aaron Burr, the vice president who shot Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. We're not that bad today, though the press would make it sometimes sound that bad. So as I look at the political situation in the United States, we do have a number of problems like debt, secondary education, political gridlock, but they're only part of the picture. And if one thinks about whether these are problems that have no solution, they do have solution in principle. Whether we'll be able to bring them off or not is an open question. But the view that sort of the Americans are in absolute decline, we're rotting like ancient Rome and so forth, this all strikes me as mistaken. So where does that leave us as to whether the American century is over? And what I'd like to suggest to you is that we not be too complacent from this picture which I've just given you about the fact that the United States is not in decline. If you look ahead to 2030, I suspect that the United States will be the largest country, the most powerful country in 2030. The National Intelligence Council, which is an organization which prepares intelligence estimates for the president, which I used to chair some time ago, makes an interesting case for a picture of 2030 with the Americans the most powerful country. So in that sense, you'd say the American era is not over. But let's stop and think again, or think a bit more carefully. Even if the United States is not in decline, is the American world order over? Now, Amitav Acharya, who is a professor at American University and author of a recent book, says yes. He was president of the International Studies Association. He says, yes, the American era is over. He said, even if the Americans are not in decline, he said, I'll hold an open mind on that, but the American era is definitely over. And if we go back to what Kai said this morning about John Eikenberry, who incidentally is here as a visiting professor at Oxford this year, I think Eikenberry would say, well, it's not really over, but it's being transmuted into a liberal world order. And this essentially was what Kai presented in the slides he had on Eikenberry. And in that sense, I think it's correct that the BRICS, whatever else we think of them, they don't offer an alternative picture of a world order. It's very different from the 1930s or from the Cold War. In the 1930s, Hitler was posing a picture of a very, very different world, a world in which democracy was discredited. Liberal democracy was over. And indeed, the idea of the League of Nations was discredited. Conquest and the master race would take over. There's nothing like that today. Whatever one thinks of Putin, that's not Putin. Putin is not a Hitler, and it's a mistake for us to sort of put him in that category. And similarly, if we look at the Cold War, there were true believers in communism. Khrushchev really did believe in communism. And he believed that there was going to be a transformation of the world along the lines of Marxist-Leninist ideology. But I think basically there are very few places where people believe that anymore. Yes, China is ruled by a Communist Party of China, but it really isn't communist. When you push hard, you find that there's very little communism there. I was invited a year or two ago to give lectures on soft power at the School of Marxism and in Peking University in Beijing. And one of the things that struck me was when I said to them, how is Marxism relevant to what you're doing today? I got the most strange, convoluted answers. And so I said, but it's really markets, not Marxism. And if you think of what really is going on in China, as some people said, it's market Leninism. You keep the Leninist political structure, but it's the markets. And if you read Xi Jinping's statements, you'll see that he doesn't put it in my terms, but that's very much what's going on. So in that sense, when people talk about the Beijing consensus as an alternative, it really isn't. It may be that in Zimbabwe, people think it's nice to have a good authoritarian system, but they are totally incapable of implementing what the Chinese have done, which has produced the kind of growth that China's had over the past 30, 40 years. So the idea that the world is a competition between liberal market ideology and a Beijing consensus, that's just not the way the world is. At the rhetoric level, you can maybe find some of this, but in reality, in practice, in policy, there's not much of it. So in that sense, I think Eikenberry is correct that what you're seeing today is not a not a challenge from the BRICS or from anybody else to the American world order. But I think the danger of our feeling complacent as a result of that is that it misleads us from what we really should be concerned about. Let me mention several things which I think are wrong with this, a sense of complacency about that. First of all, as we look back historically, the so-called liberal hegemony or liberal American world order never was a universal order. We like to treat it that way, but it really reflected the world economy. It didn't reflect the world polity. In that sense, it was never a balanced international order. Similarly, until 1991, the Soviet Union balanced American power. There was a balance of power internationally. Why didn't the Americans come to the aid of the Hungarians or the Czechs? Or why did Cuba survive despite all the efforts of the world's great superpower to overthrow it? Because of Soviet power, because power was balanced. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed how closely it was balanced and how difficult it was. But the point is, it wasn't a universal liberal order. And therefore, I think Eikenberry doesn't pay enough attention to that. He takes a global economic order and assumes it's a global world order, and it's not the same thing. The third point I would make is that after I should add two other things, that the official universal political order, the United Nations system, created in 1945, created a system of collective security. It's worth noticing that collective security, as written in the Charter, was only invoked twice. Once in 1950, because the Soviets made the mistake of boycotting the Security Council at the beginning of the Korean War, and the other time in 1990, because the Cold War was over. So the universal normative political order only worked once by mistake, and the others because the Cold War was over. And then, of course, in 1991, the Soviet Union was over. And so if you ask, when did the American era start as a global era, I suppose you'd have to start it in 1991, which is relatively recent. But if you say it's in 1991 when the world became unipolar, then when did it end? Has it ended yet or not? Well, you can make a case that it hasn't ended, because the United States is still the world's only military superpower. And what happened in 91 is the military balance of power ended, because the Soviet Union ended. And nobody has replaced that. So in that sense, with the U.S., which still has a defense budget 4 times that of China, and the only country with global military capacity, it's hard to make an argument that if you date the American era from 1991, with the beginning of unipolarity, that the American era has ended. There's another argument, though, which I'm more partial to, which is said the American era in the form of unipolarity never began. It never existed. That this illusion that somehow once the Soviet Union went away, the U.S. could rule the world was badly mistaken. And it led to people like Charles Krauthammer and other apologists for American power, enthusiasts for American power, to lead to taking risks like the Americans took with the invasion of Iraq, which were greatly mistaken and very, very costly. I think the reason for this mistake is that people hadn't paid enough attention to the growth of the complexity of the way power is distributed. I make an argument in my book for what I call a three-dimensional model of power, thinking of more of a three-dimensional chess game as a metaphor. If you think of a top board of military power, the world is unipolar and has been since 1991 and remains unipolar today. If you look at the middle board of economic relations among states, the world was multipolar in 1991 and is multipolar today. Europe, as you go back to Hamish's slides, Europe is actually, when it acts as an economic entity, larger than the United States. So economic relations The world is multipolar, military relations unipolar, and this since 91. This is not new. But most important, at the bottom level of this chessboard, the level of transnational relations, things that cross borders outside the control of governments, it makes no sense to talk about unipolarity or multipolarity. Power is chaotically distributed. If you take transnational issues, which are things that cross borders outside the control of governments, whether it be climate change, whether it be terrorists, whether it be pandemics, whether it be financial flows, which are in many days larger than the budgets of most countries, all these things are controlled by non-state actors. It's not governments which are doing this. And the only way to deal with them, essentially, is to have cooperation among governments and try to cope with it. Which means that, to my mind, the thing we should be worrying about, rather than are the BRICS about to pass the United States, I hope I've made a convincing case that they're not, but what about another power shift that we're not paying enough attention to, which I call power diffusion? I argue in this book, The Future of Power, that there are two great power shifts going on at the beginning of the century. Power transition, which we all know about for centuries. Basically, that's a transition among states, and the same as accurately put it this morning, it's a shift from west to east in this century. Power diffusion is different. It's a shift from top to bottom. In other words, it's vertical rather than horizontal. And it's a product of the information revolution. And the information revolution basically can be dated back to the 1960s in Moore's law, and the capacity to put twice as many transistors on a chip every 18 months, which leads to an extraordinary reduction in the costs of computing and communication. So, for example, just in the last quarter of the 20th century, the cost of computing went down 1,000-fold. If the cost of an automobile had gone down as rapidly as the cost of computing power, you could buy an automobile today for about 20 pounds. Anytime the price of something goes down that dramatically, the barriers to entry go down dramatically, and anybody can play in the game. And the net effect of that is not that governments are obsolete, but that the stage on which governments play is much more crowded. Give you an example. When I was a student at Exeter a long time ago, I used to call my girlfriend, now my wife, and it was about £1 a minute. In those days, the pound was about $3 a pound. We didn't talk very much, not on the size of the road stipends in those days. But, last night before I went to bed, I quickly pulled my iPhone out of my pocket, chatted with my wife, and went to bed. This is a very different world, and technology has made a huge difference. You might say, well, yeah, but you are a rich American. In fact, the capacity to communicate anywhere on Earth simultaneously has existed for a long time. In 1970, you could do it if you had a big budget, if you were a government or a corporation or something. Now anybody can do it for free on Skype. So things, technologies, and capacities in information which were once restricted to very few are now available to very many. And you see this when you try to understand Tahrir Square. You see it when you try to understand flash mobs in Turkey or Brazil. I mean, this is something which is making a difference. But I think you see it probably most dramatically when you think of the issue of cyber power, which I've been writing about recently. And there, it's interesting that what cyber does is not replace governments. Governments still remain more powerful than hackers or even criminal groups. But these non-state actors are able to do things which previously were restricted just to governments. And that's a very different world. So as we start thinking about this question of, are we being passed by the BRICS, maybe it's like this game that I used to play with my kids when they were little. And maybe you've done this with your kids. You say, watch my hand, and then you tickle them with the other hand. Maybe as we spend all our time, watch my hand about is China passing us, we forget that somebody is poking us in the ribs with another hand. And that's not just poking the U.S., it's poking everybody, BRICS as well. And therefore, what we need to think about is not whether this is a post-American world. It's not. That's what I said in my original question. The answer to my question in my title was yes and no. Is this a post-American world? Is the American era over? In terms of power transition, no. But in terms of the ability to control the world, yes. The Americans cannot control the world, nor can anyone else. And what this means is that if we're asking how to think about these problems, we have to realize that if we get stuck in the old mythological view of an American world order, with the idea that the Americans control things, and let me remind you of what I said about China, the loss of Cuba, non-rollback in Eastern Europe, it is a myth. But the myth pervades what we do when we write and talk about this. But if we get stuck in that myth, then we're not going to pay enough attention to the fact that what we need to be thinking about is how do we organize coalitions and networks to deal with these new transnational issues, whether it be international financial stability, whether it be cyber terrorism, whether it be climate change, and so forth. And in that sense, the problem is not, is the American era over, but how will the Americans, as the largest country, which they will remain, help to organize coalitions, which will include countries like China, Brazil, Russia, and others, to deal with issues which come from this diffusion of power and that are basically driving many of these transnational relations. So to summarize this, I would say that the United States will remain the biggest kid on the block, but it's going to have to learn to play well with others. Or as I put it in the title of a book which I published in 2002, the paradox of American power is that the world's only superpower can't go it alone. So is the American era over? No. Can the Americans run the world? No. So yes and no. Anyway, let me leave you there.